She looked me dead in the eyes and said, "You're only good at being gentle, never strong." That was the last time I let her fall into my arms. I didn't say anything that night. Not because I was weak, but because I finally understood she didn't see my silence as control, only as softness. And softness to her meant I was disposable. Jennifer had always been like this, proud, magnetic, impossible to please. She could shatter the room with a single look and still walk away like nothing broke. And I was always the one behind her, sweeping up the pieces, smiling when she was cruel, apologizing when she twisted the knife. But that line, it stayed with me. It echoed louder than every apology she never meant. I used to wait outside her apartment in the cold. I'd answer every call on the first ring. If she cried, I dropped everything, even if it meant letting myself drown. But in her world, the man who showed up every time was boring, predictable, forgettable. So I stopped showing up, and that's when she noticed me. The first time she called and I didn't pick up, she messaged twice. When I replied an hour later, she left me on red. She wanted me to chase her again. But I had finally learned that not every fall deserves a rescue. Michelle, her friend of all people, saw it before anyone else did. She noticed the way my voice stopped breaking around Jennifer's name. She noticed how I no longer carried the weight of someone else's chaos. "You've changed," Michelle said one evening. "I had to," I answered. Jennifer hadn't changed. She was still beautiful, still sharp-tongued, still waiting to be worshipped. But I had changed. I had learned the cost of always catching someone who enjoyed the fall more than the landing. She thought love was about being saved. I had finally realized real love doesn't ask you to drown to prove it, and by the time she reached for me again, I wasn't standing there anymore. Randall was the kind of man people often overlooked at first glance, not because he lacked presence, but because he didn't demand attention the way others did. He was quiet in the way mountains are quiet, still, patient, unmoved. The kind of man who waited instead of shouted, who listened instead of overreacting. And in Jennifer's world, that kind of man was always the easiest to underestimate. She met him during her final semester of grad school. He had just finished a long shift at the community center and was walking out with a backpack that looked older than him. She bumped into him, dropped her phone, and muttered something sharp about people not watching where they were going. He apologized anyway. She didn't forget that. Randall had that effect. He made himself easy to remember by refusing to match the noise of everyone else. When they started dating, her friends had warned her. "He's too quiet," they said, "too soft." Jennifer had laughed it off at first, saying it was refreshing to date someone who didn't need a spotlight, but that novelty faded faster than she expected. Jennifer was ambition in heels. She liked things fast, clear, and under control. Randall moved differently. He wasn't indecisive. He was deliberate, thoughtful. He didn't flinch when she raised her voice during arguments, and that unnerved her. When she accused, he didn't defend. He asked questions. When she stormed out, he stayed. To Jennifer, his calmness became frustrating. She called it passiveness. She called it weakness. And Randall, he never corrected her. He loved her, genuinely. That rare, deep love that doesn't come with conditions or scorecards. He brought her tea when she couldn't sleep, memorized how she liked her breakfast, stood in silence when she was angry, letting her burn out before offering a single line that always made her think twice. He didn't try to fix her, but he never let her forget she was cared for. Still, love, when met with imbalance, begins to buckle. And Jennifer had begun to believe that love meant being pursued to exhaustion. Randall, despite all his patience, felt it too. He noticed how her eyes started to drift mid-conversation, how her phone buzzed more than usual, how she no longer reached for his hand in crowded rooms. He noticed, but he didn't react. Because Randall had learned a long time ago that some truths didn't need to be confronted, they just needed to be accepted. It wasn't that Jennifer didn't care about him. She did, in her own way. But care isn't the same as respect. And somewhere along the line, she stopped believing Randall was the kind of man who could surprise her, because he was always there, always steady, always holding her up when she fell, until the day he didn't. That evening was ordinary in every External way. The restaurant was elegant but not loud. The food good, but unmemorable. Randall had worn the navy button-up she once said made him look like someone she could follow, but she didn't even glance at him when he walked in. She spent most of the dinner talking about her new project manager, Douglas, how sharp he was, how decisive, how he made decisions like thunder. Randall listened without interruption, stirring his coffee slowly. At one point, she looked up and said, "Sometimes I wonder if I'd be further ahead if I were with someone like that. Someone who doesn't hesitate." Randall didn't flinch. He just placed his spoon down quietly and met her gaze for the first time that night. "I never hesitated," he said softly. "I just chose not to raise my voice." She blinked, clearly thrown off. "You're too soft," she said, shaking her head. "That's always been the problem." He didn't argue. That moment, the way her voice didn't tremble when she dismissed him, something cracked open inside. Randall. Not in anger, not in pain, but in quiet finality. He drove her home like always, walked her to the door like always, waited for her to turn around and say something, like always. But she didn't. And that's when he knew. She didn't fall because she stumbled. She fell because she never thought he'd stop catching her. The next morning, Randall didn't text. Not because he wanted to play games, but because he had nothing left to say that would go unheard. Jennifer noticed it midway through her second coffee. Her phone sat silent beside her, the notification bar empty. No good morning text, no check-in, just silence. For a moment, she stared at the screen like it had made a mistake. Then she convinced herself it didn't matter. By noon, she'd replied to a few emails and set a lunch meeting with Douglas. She didn't mention Randall, didn't need to. Douglas already knew what kind of man Randall was. He'd seen him at office functions, hovering near the edge of the room like furniture. Always present, never pressing. "He's comfortable," Douglas had said once. "That's nice, but it's not exciting." Jennifer had smiled at that, not because she agreed, but because it was easier than defending someone she was starting to resent. They had lunch at the new restaurant by the river. It wasn't romantic, but it was easy. Douglas spoke with certainty about things she hadn't realized mattered to her: decisions, plans, future moves. When he paid the bill without hesitation, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't noticed in a while. Security. It wasn't love, but it was weight. And Jennifer was always drawn to gravity. Randall, meanwhile, spent that day in quiet. He went to the bookstore, read for 2 hours without checking his phone, and bought a copy of a novel Michelle once recommended to him. She'd mentioned it in passing months ago during a late-night talk at the shelter. He remembered. He always remembered. Michelle was different. She didn't demand explanations. She never measured his worth by how loud he could argue. She noticed things, like when he'd spent a full afternoon helping her fix the community kitchen pipes, and didn't once talk about it afterward. She'd brought him soup the next day. Nothing flashy, just warm and enough. They weren't close, not then. But they were beginning to understand the space between comfort and chaos. It wasn't until later that evening that Jennifer called. No warning, just her name flashing across his screen. He hesitated. When he picked up, her voice was sharper than usual. "Did I do something?" she asked, skipping the greeting. Randall leaned against the window, watching the streetlights flicker. "No," he said. "You were just honest." There was a pause. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you said what you felt, and I heard you." "You're being dramatic," she muttered. "You're twisting things." "I'm not twisting anything, Jennifer. You said I was too soft. I'm just finally listening." Another pause. Then, flatly, "So what, you're punishing me now?" Randall exhaled slowly. "No, I'm just done proving something you've already decided to reject." She hung up. The days that followed were filled with silence, but not emptiness. Jennifer didn't know how to sit with absence. She thought Randall would cave. He always did. But this time, there was nothing to cave into. He didn't fight. He didn't beg. He simply stopped holding the net beneath her. It was Michelle who saw him next. She found him sitting outside the shelter, watching the sunset bleed into the city skyline. "You okay?" she asked. He didn't pretend. He never had to with her. "I feel like I've been uninvited from my own life," he said. Michelle sat beside him, quietly. "You weren't uninvited," she said after a while. "You just stopped trying to make someone else comfortable while you were drowning." Jennifer, on the other hand, began spinning. She went out more, but laughed less. Everyone noticed it. Even Douglas, who had grown more charming with every unanswered message she sent Randall. She asked herself more than once if she had made a mistake. But pride is louder than doubt, until silence starts screaming. Late one night, she saw a photo. Michelle had posted it on her story, just a shot of the community kitchen with 2 coffee mugs in the frame. One navy, one plain white, Randall's navy mug. Jennifer stared at it for a long time. Her stomach tightened. She didn't know what she feared more, that he'd moved on, or that she'd pushed him into the arms of someone who actually saw him. She called again. This time he didn't answer, and for the first time in a long while, Jennifer felt something she hadn't felt with Randall in months: uncertainty, the one thing he had always shielded her from. Randall wasn't angry. That was the strange part. People expected fury after being discarded, expected bitterness to rise like smoke from a controlled burn. But what he felt was quieter. Heaviness. A quiet disappointment that sat with him in the morning and didn't leave when the sun went down. He still checked his phone sometimes. Not to see if Jennifer had messaged again. She had. A few times. But to look at the last unread one he never opened. It just sat there. "Can we talk?" He didn't want to talk. He wanted to feel normal again. Not like a man recovering from a long illness, but like someone remembering who he used to be before he let someone else rewrite the way he saw himself. Michelle noticed it when he started arriving early to the shelter. He used to come right before his shift. Now he came an hour early, sitting in the corner with a book, sometimes just staring out the window. She never asked questions. She just handed him coffee and let the silence do the work. One evening, as they packed donation boxes together, Michelle said, "Do you ever miss her?" He didn't answer right away. He sealed the last box with slow, even tape. Then he set it aside and leaned back against the shelf. "I miss who I thought she was." Michelle nodded like she understood, because she did. Meanwhile, Jennifer's world hadn't fallen apart, but something inside her had started to fray. She would walk into meetings with confidence, but find herself losing focus. She'd laugh at a joke, then forget what it was seconds later. She stared too long at empty chairs in coffee shops, chairs that used to hold someone who never raised his voice. She kept replaying their last conversation, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it wasn't. Randall didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He just left the door open, then quietly walked away from it. It was that calmness that haunted her. Randall had always made her feel like no matter what storm she brought into the room, he'd be standing on the other side with his hand out. But now the space between them felt too wide to cross. And worse, he didn't seem to be waiting anymore. Jennifer had always known how to apologize when she wanted something. But this time she didn't know what to say. Everything sounded smaller than the damage. Every message she typed and deleted felt like trying to sweep a flood with a dry rag. She saw Michelle again by accident. It was outside the florist downtown, where Jennifer was picking out flowers for her sister's baby shower. Michelle had just stepped out with a wrapped bouquet and looked surprised but not shaken to see her. Jennifer forced a smile. "Hey, you look good." Michelle returned the smile with a softness that wasn't smug, just real. "Thanks. You too." They stood there for a moment, 2 women in the middle of a sidewalk separated by more than traffic. Jennifer cleared her throat. "You see him often?" Michelle looked down at her bouquet. "I do." There was no malice in her voice, no triumph, just truth. Jennifer didn't know why it stung more than anything else could have. She said goodbye. First, turned before Michelle could see the expression twist on her face. Randall wasn't dating Michelle, at least not yet. But Jennifer knew. He talked to her now. trusted her in a way he once reserved for the late hours after their own arguments, when she'd fall asleep mid-sentence and wake up to find he was still there, listening. Now he listened. To someone else. Randall sat in his apartment that night, not thinking about Jennifer directly, but feeling the weight of what she left behind. Not heartbreak, but echoes. She was a storm that had passed, but the ground still hadn't dried. Pulled out an old photo, one of the few they had together, smiling on a balcony somewhere near the coast. He looked happy in it, so did she, but he couldn't remember what they were laughing about. That bothered him more than it should have. He put the photo back in the drawer, not with anger, but with resolution. Not everything that fades has to be forgotten, but it doesn't have to be remembered every day either. There was something building between him and Michelle, something unnamed and gentle. But he didn't rush it. He wasn't looking to replace one weight with another. He was learning how to breathe again. Jennifer, sitting alone in her room that same night, opened her own drawer. Inside was the small necklace Randall had given her their first year together. It wasn't expensive. He'd saved for weeks and given it to her without ceremony, saying, "I just wanted you to have something that doesn't demand attention, just deserves it." She hadn't worn it in months. Now she held it like it was the last piece of a language she no longer knew how to speak. Randall had once been soft, but now she knew. Softness wasn't weakness. It was the strength not to retaliate. When you're bleeding, the grace to let someone leave without begging them to stay. The courage to choose peace over power, and she had called it weakness. She turned off her phone that night, not to ignore anyone, but because for the first time in a long time, she realized she couldn't reach the one person she actually wanted to hear from, and worse, she no longer had the right to ask. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Randall received the invitation. A formal envelope, cream-colored with gold edges, slid through his mailbox. No return address, just his name printed cleanly on the front. He opened it slowly, thinking it was a work function or perhaps a donor event from the shelter. But the words inside hit differently. It was Jennifer's engagement announcement, to Douglas. Randall stared at it for a long moment, unsure what part unsettled him more, the fact that it was real, or the fact that his name had been included at all. He set the card down on the kitchen counter and walked away. But it stayed in his mind like static. He hadn't seen Jennifer in weeks. Her last message was still unopened, buried beneath others he hadn't found the energy to answer, and now here she was, tying herself to the man she used to describe as too loud, too forward, too much. It wasn't jealousy. Randall had let go of that. But it was something colder, a quiet awareness that he had never really been what she wanted, just what she needed until she found someone who demanded less reflection and more submission. Michelle noticed something. Was off that evening. He was quieter than usual, more inward. They were organizing boxes in the shelter's back room when she finally spoke. Did something happen? Randall hesitated. Then, Jennifer's getting married. Michelle didn't flinch. She just set the box down and leaned against the table. To Douglas, he added. A long pause followed. Are you okay? She asked gently. I don't know what I am, he said. I thought I'd feel nothing, but it feels like I got replaced while I was still healing. Michelle didn't speak right away. She just stepped closer and rested her hand on his forearm. There was no urgency in the gesture, just understanding. You weren't replaced, she said. You were released. He didn't answer, but something, in her words, clung to him through the night. Across town, Jennifer sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She looked beautiful, the kind of beauty people notice in magazines or expensive lobbies. But she didn't feel like herself. Douglas had proposed in the exact way she used to say she wanted. On a rooftop, music playing, surrounded by colleagues. It had been loud, dramatic, filled with applause, and she had smiled through all of it. But now, looking at the ring, her smile didn't feel the same. She hadn't expected Randall to respond to the invitation. But part of her had hoped he would say something. Anything. She imagined him reading it, imagined his face. She imagined him showing up, looking heartbroken, still gentle, still hers in some intangible way. But he hadn't replied. He hadn't reacted, and that silence hurt more than any words could have. Michelle walked with Randall through the park the next day. The air was cool, but not sharp. The leaves had begun to turn, the world shifting without needing permission. They sat on a bench overlooking the water. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Randall turned to her. Do you ever feel like closure isn't something you get from someone else, but something you finally allow yourself to accept? Michelle smiled softly. I think closure is just the moment you stop needing their version of the story. Randall nodded. The wind picked up, rustling the trees above them. And quietly, without drama, the page began to turn. The invitation had stayed on Randall's kitchen counter for 3 days, before he finally moved it. He didn't throw it away. He just slipped it into a drawer between a stack of old receipts and a notebook he no longer used. Out of sight, but not entirely out of mind. He didn't plan on going. He didn't even believe she expected him to. It felt more like a move made out of guilt than sincerity. A final note in a song she wasn't even sure how to end. But still, the weight of it stayed with him. Michelle asked him once more if he was okay, and this time, he didn't dodge. I think I'm tired of pretending that it doesn't hurt, he said. I don't want her back. But I think I wanted to matter more than this. They were walking home together. The air was heavier that evening, sky dim with a blanket of low clouds. The city lights reflected faintly in the puddles on the sidewalk. Michelle didn't interrupt. She let him say every word. That was the thing about her. She never tried to fix what he was feeling. She just stood next to it, steady, quiet, real. She's always known how to make a moment look beautiful, he added, even if it's built on pieces of someone else. Michelle paused beside him, hand in her coat pocket. She didn't build anything, Randall, she said quietly. She borrowed. He didn't reply, but he carried those words with him. Across the city, Jennifer stood in front of a mirror in the fitting room of an upscale boutique. The bridal assistant was clipping the back of her gown. The fabric shimmered, flawless, expensive. Her mother clapped quietly behind her. Her friends snapped pictures. There were soft laughs, compliments, everything she used to dream of. But she wasn't looking at the dress. She was staring at her own face, not the makeup, not the smile she'd rehearsed, just the eyes. There was no light in them. Later that night, alone in her apartment, she opened her messages again. Randall's last words were still there. Simple, direct. You said I was too soft. I just finally listened. She read it again, and it hit her differently now. She hadn't expected him to change. She'd expected him to wait, and he hadn't. Her chest tightened. She picked up her phone, opened a new message, and started typing. Then she erased it, and typed again, then erased it again. Her thoughts were racing too fast, and yet nothing she could write felt big enough to cross the space she'd created between them. She turned off the lamp, lay back in bed, and stared at the ceiling. The silence was louder now. Randall didn't hear from her for 2 weeks. And then, out of nowhere, she appeared at the shelter. It was raining. Not the stormy kind of rain. That makes headlines. Just a steady drizzle that soaked through your clothes before you realized you'd been outside too long. Randall had just come back from the loading dock, arms full of paper towels and canned goods. He nearly dropped them when he saw her. Jennifer stood at the entrance, umbrella dripping, eyes scanning the hallway until they landed on him. She looked different. Not sad, just quieter. He walked toward her, slow, unsure. Hey, she said, voice barely above a whisper. Hi. I wasn't sure if you'd even talk to me. I'm talking. She gave a breath of a laugh, not because it was funny, but because she didn't know what else to do. I need to say something, she said. Randall nodded once. I'm sorry, she continued. Not just for what I said, but for not seeing you, for treating your steadiness like it was something to be bored of. You weren't soft, Randall. You were solid. And He stopped her with a look. Not cold. Just honest. You don't need to explain, he said. I already made peace with it. She blinked. But I need to say it. Then say it, he said, but don't expect me to carry it for you. She looked down, her hands tightening around the umbrella. I was afraid, she admitted. Afraid that if I stayed with someone who didn't break me down, I'd have to face the parts of myself I never wanted to look at. Douglas. He's easy to lose myself in. You weren't. He didn't flinch. I know. Jennifer's voice cracked. Do you still feel anything when you see me? He didn't answer right away. Then, I feel grateful that I no longer belong to someone who made me question if love was something to earn. She closed her eyes for a second. That one landed. Deep. I'm not asking for anything, she said. Not now. Not ever again. I couldn't let it end with silence. You were too good to disappear without knowing that. Randall looked at her. Really looked. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel pulled toward her. He felt still. Centered. I hope he gives you what you're looking for, he said, voice steady. I'm not sure I know what that is anymore, she murmured. Randall didn't respond. He just stepped aside so she could leave if she wanted to, and she did. No fight, no final plea, no begging, just a quiet walk into the rain. Michelle had been in the back hallway and hadn't seen the conversation, but she saw the look on Randall's face when he came around the corner. She set down the stack of towels she was folding. Was that her? He nodded. Michelle didn't ask what was said. Instead, she poured him a cup of tea and placed it in front of him at the break room table. He sat down. Looked at her. She apologized, he said. Michelle gave a quiet hum. Do you feel any different? He thought about it. Not just for a second, but long enough to be sure. I feel done. Michelle smiled softly. That's not a bad thing. He smiled too, faintly. No, he agreed. It's not. And then without another word, they sat together in silence. The good kind, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Jennifer didn't get the ending she had imagined. There was no dramatic reunion, no desperate embrace in the rain, no music swelling behind an apology. Just the soft ache of knowing she'd come too late. Her wedding to Douglas went on as planned. The venue was flawless, the lighting golden, the guests dressed in shades of silver and cream, and yet something underneath it all felt hollow. Every step down the aisle was rehearsed, every smile stretched just enough to hide the tension. Douglas stood waiting at the end of the aisle, sharp in a black suit, surrounded by a world that admired him. But Jennifer didn't feel seen. Not in the way she once did when Randall watched her, like she was the only voice in a crowded room. The vows were exchanged, the champagne poured, the photos taken. But the moment she walked into their hotel suite that night, heels in her hand, hair loosened from too many forced smiles, she felt it hit. She had everything she claimed to want, and it felt like nothing. Meanwhile, Randall's life moved in a direction that didn't announce itself loudly. It simply grew, quietly, consistently, better. He was promoted at the shelter, offered a lead coordinator role for new outreach programs. Michelle had encouraged him to apply, even when he wasn't sure he deserved more. He did. The community responded. People noticed him, not because he demanded attention, but because he created impact. He started mentoring teens, showing them how strength didn't have to shout to be felt, how resilience could exist in stillness. He didn't block Jennifer, but he didn't reply to her either. She messaged once, months after the wedding. I saw your interview on the city news. You looked proud. You should be. He left it on red. Michelle and Randall's relationship didn't need labels. It grew like ivy, slow, deliberate, deeply rooted. They didn't talk about forever. They talked about today, about how good the coffee was, or how the sunset spilled over the rooftops like fire melting into the edge of the sky. She never made him earn peace. She met him in it. One day, nearly a year after everything had unraveled, Randall was invited to speak at a corporate event on emotional intelligence and leadership. He almost declined until he saw the hosting sponsor. It was Jennifer's firm. He said yes. He stood behind the podium, the same calm presence he had always been. But this time, he was heard. The crowd leaned in. Executives nodded. Staff took notes. And in the back row, wearing an ivory blazer and a forced smile, Jennifer sat, frozen in place. He never looked directly at her, but he knew she was there. He spoke about accountability, about empathy, about how true leadership doesn't come from volume, but from how people feel after you leave the room. They don't remember the power in your voice, he said. They remember whether they felt safe in your silence. Jennifer didn't move for the entire session, not even once. After the applause, she stood like everyone else, but didn't step forward to say hello. She couldn't. She had nothing left to say that wouldn't embarrass them both. She watched him from a distance, watched others shake his hand, watched Michelle walk up to him with her soft confidence and place a hand on his shoulder like it belonged there. That was the moment Jennifer understood. The real revenge had never been a loud rejection or a show of spite. The real revenge was seeing the man she thought she could diminish rise into a life she would never be invited into again. Randall didn't need to burn her bridges. He just never looked back while walking across his own. He and Michelle left the building quietly like they always did. No spectacle, no grand gestures, just certainty. Jennifer stood alone as the conference room emptied, her heels echoing softly against the polished floor. Douglas had left early. Something about a dinner meeting she didn't mind. His silence didn't bother her the way Randall's once did, because Douglas's silence was empty. Randall's had always been full. Outside, the sky had turned a soft lavender, the kind of color that only appeared when the light shifted just enough to hint that change was already happening. Randall paused by the car, looking up at the horizon. "You okay?" Michelle asked, watching him. He smiled, slow and certain. "Yeah, I think I've never been more than okay." She reached for his hand. They didn't need to say anything else. Back in the city, Jennifer returned to her apartment alone. She poured herself a glass of wine she didn't finish and sat by the window watching the lights blink on across the skyline. Somewhere out there, a version of her might have made different choices. But not this one. This one had watched the quiet man become everything she pretended she didn't need. And now he was gone in every way that mattered. Randall didn't win by proving her wrong. He won by never needing to anymore. And as he stepped forward into a life that asked for no permission, that held no apologies, he did so with one truth sealed quietly into his story. He was never too soft. She just never knew how to hold someone who didn't need to be chased, only chosen. And now, she would spend the rest of her life remembering what it felt like to lose a man who never raised his voice, only his standards.